Hello everyone, we're back here for our third video covering modules 5 and 6. As I mentioned, I think last week and the week before, I was going to save all these videos, and just by way of quick sort of remembering in memory, we started with week 1, language, thought, and philosophy in ancient Athens, then Athenian philosophy and the return of the irrational. Week 3, which was last week, monotheism and early Western thought, followed by enlightenment and the return of reason. And now weeks 4 and 5, which are today, I want to take a look at concepts of the self and the social individual. There's basically 3 individuals in this particular class we want to look at. John Locke, Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, and John Stuart Mill. So we're talking about society and the balance between the individual and that social formation, because one cannot get pushed too far in one direction or the other. But what we want to look at here is how society creates a concept of the self, right? The social individual. John Locke, writing in the late 1600s, came up with a theory of mind, right, that is really the beginnings, right, that historical origin of the modern conceptions of identity and self. And what this means is Locke sort of stumbled or created something that is still relevant to us today. Obviously, slight modifications, but that modern conception of identity and the self are quite remarkable in Locke's work. And what is really unique is the first time that we think of the self as a continuously developing thing, a consciousness that grows from birth to death. That is remarkable because until this point, we have an idea that goes all the way back to Plato, that somehow we were individuals who had all kinds of information stored within us. And it was simply a matter of insight and education and reflection that would allow us to discover what was already there. Descartes, last week, we talked about how the notion of God was something innate. We have innate ideas. Locke says, no, we don't. Who we are and the way we see the world, we perceive the world, has everything to do with the development of our consciousness from birth to death. And we basically start with an empty mind at birth, or what he calls a tabula rasa, right? A blank slate. And that tabula rasa is shaped by sensuous experience, our various sensations, our education, our use of reason regarding reality, how we encounter it, how we absorb it, how we make sense of it. So Locke's idea of consciousness also exhibits the idea of sociability, because one consciousness is always connected with another, hence these early ideas about society and sociability. And this even extends to certain religions. In Buddhism, for example, the idea that there is no individual person, an individual self. We are all interconnected. And Locke kind of taps into the same idea without calling it that. But this notion of sociability, the notion of a blank slate for a mind that grows and develops through life, those are the utterly unique ideas that Locke presents to us. And he also thinks that personal identity, right, consists of not this idea of a substance that is always there, but the idea of consciousness, who we are as self-aware individuals, our awareness of being connected to others, being connected to society, being connected to grander things, not necessarily religion, but some people call it a spiritual connection, but a connection with the world. That's the really important part. So this idea of consciousness is something that we grow into and we retain through our life. And what's really interesting, and especially in light of the pervasiveness of, say, Alzheimer's and delirium and loss of memory, Locke says something really interesting. He says, even if we lose our memory and we cannot remember these past events, we still remain the same person that we were before. Why? Because others identify who we are. Even if your parents lose their memory through Alzheimer's, you still know who they are. So they may not, but you will. And there's that sociability part, right? That interconnectedness. So the idea of a consciousness, the identity of one, is not only self-consciousness, but the awareness and recognition and identity of that consciousness by another. So we can lose our memory, but we still remain the same person because we may have lost our memory, but others have not lost their memory of us. So the I, right, that self, is easily here supposed to stand in also for the same person. So that's a pretty remarkable idea at a time when Alzheimer's was not even, sort of not invented, but discovered, because certainly people would lose, their minds, they would forget who they were, and that was around, but we have a specific name for these things. And sure enough, Locke says, not to worry. If others remember who you are, you have not lost your identity, at least in the eyes of other people. Now, another thinker that we want to look at here today is Hegel, a German philosopher and a very important figure in the 19th century German idealism. Just like Locke, I should say, Hegel was also concerned with consciousness, self-consciousness, and especially the self-conscious individual and its place in the world, right? Its recognition that it belongs to the world. And if things go well, you feel at home in the world. You see your desires, your dreams, your aspirations reflected back to you in the world in which you live. Now, it doesn't always happen that way. And one of the most important issues that Hegel had to deal with in the early 1800s was alienation. And alienation was caused by this increasingly fragmentary sense of modernity and the fragmented self, because the fragmented self was pulled between family ties, the community, having to work, having to be both a citizen and a subject of that state. So we're getting pulled in different directions. And of course, ultimately, alienation is something that we need to deal with. It's just as prevalent now as it was in the early 1800s at the time when Hegel was writing. And for Hegel, he believed that alienation was caused by that fragmented self, or the ability of modernity to fragment us into various different versions of ourselves. And so the alienation is that stage of disconnection that we feel at first with that simple unity in the world. And that could be a simple unity that stems from family life, living, under the same roof as your family. You feel connected. You feel connected to your parents, your siblings, your community, your neighborhood. Then all of a sudden you have to move away to go to school, to work somewhere else. And so alienation begins to kind of erode that sense of wholeness, that sense of unity that the individual typically has, but now sort of is tested by modernity. Now, Hegel struggled to try to come up with various sort of solutions to this notion of alienation. And although he doesn't use the term alienation before 1807, now 1807 is an important year for Hegel. It's when he wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit, a very important book in his bibliography, and a book that I would recommend if you ever try to read it slowly, read it carefully, because it is chock-a-block full of interesting ideas. Now, up to that point, Hegel was still struggling with the notion of alienation, and he had come up with sort of three different versions, three different solutions. The first one was love. All right, love restores a unity between individuals, and what he meant was the love that we lose when we leave, in a sense, the family, right, the family nest, and we go out into the world, we can recover that sense of love with another new person. So we feel whole again because that other person allows us to reunite ourselves. And we end up feeling, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of awareness in the eyes of another person. So that alienation we feel is temporarily overcome by that other person when we fall in love with them. We fall in love with each other. And that love is the way in which we can restore that unity that we lost originally when we left the household. And so it restores a unity between individuals and between individuals and the world, without at the same time annihilating the individual to the state, right, to society. Then in 1800, the love piece was late 1798, 99, 1800. Religion replaces love. And religion, enables individuals to transcend the kind of the finiteness of the world, that we're just here, for a period of time. And for Hegel, religion transcends the finiteness of life with the infinite life. That is something that we would feel motivated to do well in this world, because we're able to go to heaven or go to whatever place in your religion that says, this is beatitude. This is the best of the best. So religion replaces love, and what happens is we feel that infinite love from the spirit or the Godhead that is part of your religion. So that's the second one. The third one, and this is the one that Hegel essentially sticks with for the rest of his writing period, which is again another 30 years, is reason. Right? Reason reconciles the alienation that the person feels by again looking to the structures, the institutions that culture has created. And so philosophy, which is thinking through something, thinking about something, is able to overcome alienation because we look at the various levels of consciousness. There is consciousness when we're first born, self-consciousness as we realize who we are. And then we end up reaching this period of absolute consciousness or absolute spirit when we see reflected back to us in the world all of the aspirations that we consider ourselves to be worthy of. And these are social institutions, religious institutions, political institutions, all of the institutions that help us reconnect with the world. So these institutions mediate us, right, from the self to that greater sense of a social individual. So when it comes to alienation, first it's love, then religion, and then finally reason that allows Hegel to kind of reconstitute us and overcome alienation. And he says that we do it by submitting our natural physical self to the rights and duties that are required of us by these new institutions that allow us to reintegrate ourselves into society. So we give up a little bit of who we are, but if we follow the rights and duties that are expected of us in society, we end up, in a sense, reconstituting ourselves. So depending on what that society is like, that can be something that can bring us a real deep sense of connectedness. We know our place in the world. Now, since the 1800s, we've rethought these ideas a lot. And some of those positions that are expected of us in society become gender roles. And those are things that we have pushed back on. So each time, each generation rethinks, right, those rights and duties in order to try to fit into society better. Now, the last person is John Stuart Mill, an English professor, very influential thinker in English liberalism and utilitarianism. And Mills, as a utilitarian, looks really at one simple thing, right, that makes society function, and that is utility or the greatest happiness principle. Now, what is that? The idea is that pleasure, or at least freedom from pain, is really what matters as a desirable end in itself and as a means to itself. So Mill's principle of the greatest happiness is, for him, a prescription for human social conduct. Continue doing things that will generate pleasure and avoid things that will generate pain. Very simple. So that's a utilitarian perspective. Anything that generates a greater amount of happiness and goodness in society, maybe not always for people, but for society, is considered good. So the utilitarian standard, right, for what is right in human conduct is not the individual's own happiness, but the happiness of all. So whatever generates happiness, in a sense, across the board, not everybody will be happy, but as many people as possible will be happy. That, for Mill, is that greatest happiness principle. And he says very clearly and very simply, the ultimate end is an existence, or a social existence, that should be painless and, as far as possible, rich in enjoyment, both in terms of quantity and quality. So when we talk about pleasure, it's a very broad term. Aesthetic pleasure, gastronomic pleasure, intellectual pleasures. These are pleasures that we feel that are important to us, but we want to live in a society that allows us to exercise those pleasures. But remember, the idea of the greatest happiness, right, or the greater good, always applies to society first and then to the individual. The idea, of course, being that the two of them should go hand in hand. Not all the time, but for the most part. Okay, so that is week 5, module 5, and this is now the last one here. This is module 6, politics and the divine right of kings. Now these two kind of sit together because prior to that, prior to the ideas that we're presenting, there were societies, quote unquote, not perhaps recognizable to us, as inhabitants of the 21st century, but these were social formations. And as you can imagine, when you are living in an era where kings and royalty have got ultimate power, there has to be a way to kind of control that so that they don't abuse it. And one of the ways in which it was done, and if you look at the date, right, the earliest version of some kind of document to control the power of the king and the monarchy was the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta was put together in 1215 for a variety of reasons. Now you can see here in this short paragraph, I've kind of listed all of them. Now, if you are asked a question on the Magna Carta, remember the questions are either true, false, or short statements. So if you remember just a few of these, that is more than enough. Okay, so what was the Magna Carta? What was its purpose? Well, its main purpose was to create peace between what was an unpopular king, right, an abusive king, and a group of rebel barons that were fighting to try to control and rein in this king. So the first thing, its first purpose was to create peace between these two groups. It also sought to protect church rights against an unlawful or an abusive king. It also was trying to make sure that these rebel barons would stay out of prison, because all they were trying to present was a document that the king needed to sign to basically kind of curb his abuses, right? That's really what it was. So the fourth one, access to justice and reparation. If there were abuses by the king, that you could at least go to a court to have your case heard, and at least some kind of retribution or sort of restitution. The fifth one, there were limitations to feudal payments to the crown, because at this point, the society and the economic part of society is simply serfs. Not slaves, but serfs. And serfs never owned property, but would actually till the soil on behalf of these barons. And yes, people wanted some rights. I mean, I don't want to work myself to death and have nothing to show for myself or my family. So there's got to be limitations. So you can see the Magna Carta really was about limitations, right? To create peace, protect church rights, access to justice and reparation, limitations on feudal payments. Because at this point, as I've mentioned now, the nature of government was very poorly defined. I mean, government was really the monarchy or the aristocracy. And as you can imagine, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the nature of government was prone to abuses. And this is what the Magna Carta was responding to. It was also part of wider proposals for political reforms, again, to write down and put down on paper and sign into law these proposals for political reform, so that abuses by the king and the monarchy and the aristocracy would at least be curbed. And perhaps the most important one is the clause number 61, which is, and this one should sound familiar because it's still around, the principle that no one, not even the king himself or a lawmaker or an ex-president maybe, is above the law. That idea comes from the Magna Carta. So what was it in general? It was a document aimed at curtailing the abuses of the monarchy and the aristocracy, as well as political reforms up to and including the principle that not even the king is above the law. So that's really kind of the main idea of the Magna Carta. Now, around the same time, because of these developments and political reforms, there's pushback, right? Once you give somebody an inch, right, they want a mile. And much later on, writers like Thomas Hobbes, writing again in the 1600s, these political reforms clearly were not enough, because in England, political skirmishes, religious skirmishes, political reforms that were accepted and others were rejected, eventually led to the English Civil War in the mid-1600s. And one of the individuals who saw this firsthand and managed to escape to France temporarily was Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes, in his response to the English Civil War and to the lack of political reforms that would stop something like this from ever happening again, basically wrote the Leviathan. And the Leviathan is a book that is, in a sense, the foundation of Western political philosophy. It's still referred to regularly. It is such an important book. So it lays the foundation for political philosophy. And what it does is it shows the necessity of a strong central authority. Now, that kind of sounds, counterintuitive to the Magna Carta. But Hobbes says, no, we need a strong central authority to avoid the evils of discord and civil war. And that's not to say that the monarchy is now allowed to abuse, is allowed to abuse its powers. No, what he's arguing is for a strong central authority that is a sovereign that will now become the go-to person with any kind of disagreements or any kind of legal problems that individuals may face, because in discussing the Leviathan and in trying to present it as an idea that is worth considering, Hobbes comes up with this idea of the state of nature. It's a kind of before picture, but really the state of nature it's already within society. Because I say that because individuals, human beings, actual human beings, natural beings, are part of society. So what he's trying to do is, although he presents this kind of before picture of a state of nature, war of all against all, and there's absolute liberty and absolute freedom, but there's also absolute, terror, because there are no laws. So what Hobbes is trying to present is a legal system that is controlled by a strong central authority. And really, that's it. He's trying to present a legal system that people are going to buy into. Because if we can set this up and we can establish this, it becomes a way for individuals to live much more safely. So that drive that we have, right, the drive for self-preservation that we would perhaps encounter in a state of nature, that drive for self-preservation is what causes otherwise selfish and, prideful human beings to leave that quote-unquote state of nature and form a social contract, which is simply a legal contract. And we transfer some of those individual rights as people, retaliation, retribution, vengeance. If somebody has wronged us or murdered a member of our family, Hobbes says, no, this is going to be chaos. We need a legal system that we can all adhere to, because we are both, looking out for ourselves, and we are also looking out for, our family members and our stuff, right, our property. But we need to buy into it, because if we can agree to it, then individuals freely submit to this sovereign authority that is powerful, because now it can put people to death, it can imprison people, it can imprison criminals. And so individuals, because they are, their self-preservation is paramount, and we're also selfish and horrible people otherwise, but we also fear violent death, right? We fear being hurt. So we go, okay, if there's a strong sovereign authority that will protect me, then yeah, I'm in. And that's literally how Hobbes sells this idea. So he says, look, really we have no choice in the matter, right? But in return, we can guarantee unknown levels of protection by that strong central authority, the crown, the sovereign. And so the sovereign becomes this constituting power that can create laws, but it can also enact laws. And the constituting capacity of lawmaking was something that was completely missing in the state of nature, but is absolutely the central focus, right? The cornerstone, the keystone, whatever you want to call it, of the social contract. We agree to submit to this foreign authority on condition that it protects us through this legal mandate. And we agree to that legal mandate, and we know that if we do so, we are going to be able to protect ourselves and, and our loved ones. So the last person we look at is Otto Friedrich von Gierk, which I believe is how you pronounce his name. And he was a German scholar who wrote a book called Political Theories of the Middle Ages. It came out in 1900. So a book from at least 100 years ago. And in it, Gierk looks at political doctrines that lead up to the Renaissance. Now, perhaps we could have placed him before Hobbes, because although Gierk was writing in the 1900s, the ideas that he's discussing is kind of that in-between state between the Magna Carta and Hobbes's ideas in the 1600s. Because the Renaissance kind of begins, depending on where you're looking, around the 1400s, more or less. So what Gierk is talking about is throughout the Middle Ages, right, there's a period leading up to the Renaissance in the 1400s, but certainly part of the Magna Carta. He says that throughout the Middle Ages, the framework for all the political doctrines, notions of the individual, notions of the social self, were all part of what he called the medieval spirit. And what was that? The medieval spirit was a system of thought that resulted from, and this is something that Hegel would have been concerned with, it was a system that resulted from the idea of a community together in which God, through its representative, the king, himself had constituted all of humanity. So we have a direct line from a Godhead, an entity, through the king, and this is what the divine right of kings is all about, and the idea of God on earth, represented by the king, creates a community that is now basically subsumed under this monarchy. So it's the idea of a totality, a community that is connected everyone to everyone else, and medieval politics really starts, according to Gierk, from this notion of an organic whole. So the notion of alienation is not even an idea. If you are part of an organic whole, you feel connected. You feel connected to yourself, your family, your community, your larger organization, the various institutions that protect your selfhood, and it moves all the way up and eventually through the king right up to God. So medieval politics starts with this idea of an organic whole, and from that, each person is given an intrinsic value, right down to the individual, whether you're a serf or whether you're a baron, an aristocrat, or the king himself, or the queen even, but typically a king. All of these people are connected to each other, and hence this organic whole. And from that, the notion of the medieval spirit is this idea of not just a harmony, but a divine harmony. This idea that the universal whole stems all the way from God down to the last serf. So the idea of a Godhead, of course, the church at this point is very powerful. It is basically the society. And remember, churches at this point had their own armies. They had their own, don't even call them politicians, but representatives on earth. So the notion of an organic whole, a divine harmony, animated by one spirit, this living organism, this is what the Middle Ages were like. So people felt a sense of connectedness to the community. Social order consisted in the subordination of all the individuals, the plurality of individuals, all into this organic unity. So we look at it and say, well, we live in a kind of fragmented world today because we're getting pulled in various directions. But back in the Middle Ages, there was a sense of a living organism being that society. Everyone felt part of a greater unity. So the essence of that social organism is unity, the idea of a governing body, and this objective was best viewed as part of this single unity. It starts with a single individual and moves all the way in a series of connections. It's almost to say that the connective tissue is that medieval spirit that connects the single individual, the serf, or someone like them, all the way up to God. Now, let us remember that this organic analogy, right, this physical structure of an organism, the living organism, the divine harmony, the organic unity, and all the organic whole, all that stuff, all that ultimately was simply an analogy which was nothing more than just a scaffold, right, to build up around these ideas of the society of the Middle Ages. In other words, it looked like an organism. It functioned like an organism, but it was just an analogy. That's all it was. It clearly was not a living organism. It may have functioned like that. It may have been considered that way, but it was only an analogy. It was a scaffold that was required to build up around all these various institutions in order to try to find the connective tissue between a serf, which is of course a pretty low form of life in society, and to give that person purpose and say, you know, ultimately you're connected to God through your community, through your monarchy, and all the way up, right up to God. That's why it was there. But let's remember, it was only an analogy. Okay, so we managed to cover everything. These are all the salient points, the essential points. I will keep making these for this week. Don't forget you've got your test finishing up on the 16th. And basically it's true-false questions, and there's about maybe 10 or 12 short answer questions. But the true-false questions should be fairly straightforward. And everything I've discussed in these videos are the things that will appear on the test. That's how I was able to structure it. As well, don't forget your first essay, which is due on the 16th. If you have any questions, any issues, please contact me as soon as possible, because it is the 14th, so it's essentially due in a couple of days. So looking forward to reading them. Any questions, please contact me, and I will be posting this. Obviously, you're watching this on YouTube, but don't forget that the other 2 videos are also there for you to watch. So I will talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.